Welcome back to the Bible Made Easy with Stephen Craig. In one of our previous videos, we saw how the children of Israel went from Egypt to Mount Sinai. And in today's lesson, we want to take the children of Israel from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land. In our previous lesson, we saw how Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt through the Red Sea to Mount Sinai. There at Mount Sinai, they received the law. They built the tabernacle, and also the people were numbered. We looked at what it would look like, their camp, what we call the camp of Israel. We had the tabernacle in the middle with the holy place and the most holy place separated by the veil there. We had the outer court that surrounded the tabernacle. We had the priests, Moses and Aaron, their family here camped out front to the east of the tabernacle. And then we had the other Levites camped around. And when they moved the tabernacle, these Levites had responsibility for tearing down this tent structure and then, of course, rebuilding it when they came to the new location. And then in turn, God had the 12 tribes camped around the tabernacle, 3 to the east, 3 to the south, to the west and north. And he gave them specific marching orders, how they were to, they were to lead out, and then certain Levites carrying the framework and curtains were to go, and then the more tribes were to go, and then the Kohath would go bearing the furnishings of the tabernacle. And so he had specific marching orders, and we said in our last video that shows us the importance of God doing things decently and in order. Well, they did all those things, received the law, numbered the people, built the tabernacle. In Numbers 14, they left Sinai and went to the south of the Canaan land. And they sent spies in to spy out the land to see if it was a good land or not. And the children of Israel could have been in the Promised Land within 2 years after leaving Egypt. But what we find is when they sent the 12 spies, they took one man from each tribe to go in and spy out the land. And they went throughout the Canaan land, and they came back and they said, yes, it is a land flowing with milk and honey, but the people of the land are big and strong, and they have fortified cities. They said there are giants in the land, and so we were like grasshoppers in our own sight. Only Joshua and Caleb gave a good report, and they said, no, we can conquer the people, God is with it, but because of the other 10 spies, because of their negative report, the people were discouraged and refused to go forward. And it's interesting that of the 12 spies, we only know Joshua and Caleb. We remember the names of the 2 positive. These other 10 spies died very shortly in a plague, and as a result of their negative message, the children of Israel had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years before they went into the Promised Land. Now, when Moses was still alive, after he led the people in their 40 years throughout the wilderness, and they came up on the east side. Now God told him to leave Edom alone, to leave Moab alone, and Ammon, because they were related. Remember, the Edomites were descendants of Esau, and Moabites and Ammonites, they were descendants of Lot, were also a relative of Abraham. So God said, don't harass these nations. But Israel came up on the east side of the Jordan. They conquered Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and Og, the king of Bashan. Now it's interesting that they mentioned Og. They said he was the last of the remnants of the giants. But we know that later, in the time of David, we read about the giants of Goliath. But it's interesting that this Og, if you look at the word, it said he was the last of the remnants of the giants. The word there was Rephaim. And what's interesting is that there's different names for giants throughout the scriptures. And it seems that some giants were bigger than others. And what I find interesting is this is very consistent with, you see other people who have researched giants. You see many things on the internet and on YouTube. And it seems that they're, even in the Americas, when they have bones and remnants of giants, that some giants were in the 7 to 9 foot range, and others were like in the 10 to 12 foot range. Well, what's interesting about Og, they don't tell exactly how big he is, but they had an iron bedstead that was over 13 feet tall. So he was definitely an exceptionally large giant, because later when David's going to confront Goliath, he's more in the 8 to 9 foot range, or I should say 8 to 10 foot range. We don't know exactly. It just says that he was 9 cubits in a span. So the children of Israel, as they conquered the land on the east side of the Jordan, there were Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh had cattle. And they said that they would like to receive their inheritance on this side of the land. And Moses was angry with them at first, afraid they were going to discourage the rest of the brethren, but then they said, no, we'll build cities for our families and sheepfolds for our cattle, but then we'll go over and help you conquer the land. So with that, Moses was appeased. So after Moses went up on Mount Nebo, it said to the top of Pisgah here in land of Moab, it said that he was able to look over and he viewed the promised land. Then Joshua took over the leadership, and of course he led the children of Israel across the Jordan. They captured Jericho and Ai. They systematically they conquered the central portion of Palestine, the Canaan land. They conquered people to the south and to the north, and then they divided up their land like this among the 12 tribes. And what's interesting, as you look at this, you said, well, I don't see the name of Joseph. He was one of the sons, but it's because he was given a double portion. He had two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and we see that they received an inheritance among the tribes. Of course, half the tribe of Manasseh was on the east, and the other on the west. So you had 2.5 tribes on the east, and the 9.5 tribe received their inheritance on the west side. I have a more detailed map that shows the inheritance of the children of Israel. And what's interesting is you don't see the name Levi. And that's because the Levites, because they were the priest of God, they didn't receive land inheritance or a section of land like the other tribes, but because they were priests, they were given 48 cities that were scattered throughout the Canaan land. And that way they had places where they could live with their family, have their cattle, their vineyards, and so on, and then go in turn, of course, to serve God at the tabernacle. When they first came to the land of Canaan, the tabernacle was going to be set up as Shiloh. You notice when they were traveling in the wilderness, God said that you'll put the tabernacle in the place where I choose to put my name. Well, at first, because it's going to be Shiloh, and of course we know then later in the days of David, it's going to be Jerusalem. But for now, in the early days, the tabernacle is going to be set up in Shiloh. And Shiloh is also an interesting city, because among the 48 cities given to the Levites, 6 were to be cities of refuge. You had Kadesh, Shiloh, and Hebron on the west side. On the east side, you had Golan, Ramoth Gilead, and you had Bezer. And these cities of refuge were set up because in ancient times they didn't have prisons. But if someone killed someone accidentally, you would flee to one of these cities of refuge, or if you killed someone anyway, you would flee to a city of refuge. And then what happened, these Levites of the city, they were actually like part of the legal system for Israel. Remember I told you that Mosaic law was unique because it was both a religious and a civil law. Well, this is a good example, because if you killed someone, you would flee to one of these cities of refuge. And you see they were strategically placed throughout the land of Canaan, because if you killed someone, his family had the right to kill you. But if you killed someone, you could flee to one of these cities of refuge and be safe. And what would happen is it was the responsibility of those Levites of those city to search out your case. If they saw that you had a grudge in the past and maybe you'd killed someone intentionally, they would turn you over to the next of kin, and then your life would be taken. But if they searched out the case and it found that it was accidental death and you were innocent, then you'd have to live in that city of refuge until the death of the high priest. So this was not a determined amount of time, but just whoever was serving as the high priest at the time. You would stay in that city till the death of that high priest, and then you were able to return to your inheritance without any fear of retribution. So this is a great lesson to see how God dealt with his people. Now in our next study, we're going to look at Judges, because in the first few hundred years that the children of Israel lived in the Canaan land, they didn't have a king. Instead, they were not really ruled, but God saved them many times when they were harassed by an enemy through Judges. So that'll be our next study. Thanks for your attention to this lesson.